in support of Kash Patel as the leftist commies continue to spew lies, misinformation, and these are Mr. Patel's allies: Stu Peters, Julian Cater, Guy Reffitt. On the other hand, consider who is warning us about Mr. Patel. Former Trump officials who know him, like Attorney General Bill Barr, CIA Director Haspel, Defense Secretary Mark Esper, and National Security Advisor John Bolton. All of these were Republican appointees who worked with Patel, who know him well, and warn us not to do this. Don't give this responsibility to this man. All Republican appointees. Mr. Patel has left a long trail of grievances, lashing out at anyone who is not completely aligned with him. He calls Democrats, quote, vindictive, evil, and vicious, and repeatedly attacks Republican senators who don't toe the MAGA line. I've read Mr. Patel's book, Government Gangsters. It includes an enemies list at the end of the book, 60 names, members of the deep state in the word of Kash Patel, which includes distinguished public servants from both political parties. What do they all have in common, the 60 people on this hit list? From Attorney General Bill Barr and Merrick Garland to former FBI directors Bob Mueller and Chris Wray, they've all had the misfortune of crossing paths with the vindictive Kash Patel. Mr. Patel claims he respects law enforcement, but his words and actions just demonstrate his disdain for the FBI. He has said on day one he plans to, quote, shut down the FBI headquarters. And he's falsely claimed that the FBI, quote, was planning the January 6th event for a year beforehand. There is no truth to that statement, Mr. President, and he is casting aspersions on the FBI that are undeserved. Mr. Patel's record demonstrates that he's dangerous, inexperienced, and dishonest. He should not and cannot serve as an effective FBI director. Mr. Patel has been crystal clear that he plans on using the FBI's vast surveillance and investigative authority to, quote, come after, close quote, the president's enemies. It is shocking that my Republican colleagues are willing to support him, despite the serious threat he poses to our national security. And I'm sorry to say I believe they will quickly come to regret this vote. When I think of giving this man a 10-year tenure as director of the leading criminal, I cannot imagine a worse choice. You want the person that has that job and that power to destroy people simply by investigation, to show some temperament and some judgment. Kash Patel shows just the opposite. He is neither qualified nor prepared to assume this responsibility. I will be voting no and plead with my Republican colleagues. Please think twice before creating this situation and making it even worse. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from California is recognized.
Mr. President, I too rise today to oppose the nomination of Kash Patel to serve as director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Now, let me begin by saying to Americans watching at home who may not be completely up to speed as to what's going on, the importance of this specific nomination, or wondering, who is Kash Patel? We might have been distracted these last few weeks by a rush of headlines coming out of the White House, maybe preoccupied with the cost of groceries that are rising by the week. You may have, if you caught any news, been hearing about how President Trump, the richest president in history, has given Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, unprecedented access to millions of Americans' sensitive private information. Yes, Elon Musk has access to your personal private information, from social security numbers to home addresses to your tax information. There's been a lot going on. All the while, President Trump is also trying to lay the groundwork to pass another massive tax cut for billionaires. So if you've been busy and struggling to keep up, I understand. So let me try to break it down for you. Only in the year 2025, when Donald Trump seems to have a headlock on the Republican Party, could a nominee this extreme and this unqualified be considered or confirmed to lead the FBI. No party of Reagan would ever support this big a threat to American freedom and our national security. No party of Lincoln could ever support this big a source of division among Americans. And yet, here we are, pretending as if a man who promised to shut down the FBI headquarters on day one and turn it into a museum for the deep state is now fit to lead the FBI. You see, time and again, Kash Patel has shown that his loyalty lies not with the rule of law, but with Donald Trump. Why? Because he knows that Donald Trump is his cash cow. Trump is Kash Patel's ticket to selling more books. It's his calling card to try to book the next podcast interview, and certainly key to landing his next job. Frankly, it's a pattern we've seen from all too many of the nominees that Donald Trump has picked for his second administration. These are people whose sole qualification is allegiance to Trump. This should disqualify any nominee, but it's particularly concerning for a nominee slated to lead the nation's premier law enforcement agency. When it comes to protecting the security of our nation, there is no room between patriotism and patronage. The American people need and deserve a public servant who is 100% committed to the around-the-clock safety of the American people. Unfortunately, through his actions over the course of the last several years, his conduct this past month before the Senate Judiciary Committee, Kash Patel has demonstrated a dangerous lack of judgment, lack of preparation, and lack of independence. He's shown that he's either unwilling or unable of putting politics aside in order to protect the American people and uphold the Constitution, should he be confirmed to lead the FBI. And throughout his career, he's shown a clear pattern of loyalty to Trump and of self-dealings at the expense of the American people. That includes undermining the FBI's work in order to protect Trump from investigation, profiting off of conspiracies about a, quote, deep state, and promoting an enemies list targeting public servants, selling picture books to spread conspiracy theories to children about the 2016 election, endangering the lives of American service members after inserting himself into a hostage rescue operation, refusing to commit in his confirmation hearing to enforcing existing gun laws that protect lives and have saved lives, holding millions of dollars in unvested stock in a foreign company tied to forced and child labor, even producing a song and financially supporting the families of insurrectionists who violently beat Capitol police officers on January 6th. And now it appears that this list includes potentially having lied under oath in his confirmation hearing about the role he played in firing career FBI employees based on their perceived loyalties. After we heard him swear in committee that he played no role in the firings, whistleblowers are coming forward to tell us otherwise. At the very least, this charge is so serious that it warrants further investigation. Colleagues, stretching the truth or potentially outright lying may score on points with President Trump, but as director of the FBI, it will only put American lives at risk. Think about it. To all the Americans who might be watching from home, you wouldn't put an arsonist in charge of a fire department, would you? But with Kash Patel atop the FBI, that's exactly what we'd get. Career law enforcement will continue to be purged. The FBI will be weaponized for political gain, and our communities will be less safe. I want to make one final point to our Republican colleagues. Throughout this body's history, the Senate has had not just the opportunity, but the responsibility to serve as a check on executive overreach. Senators of both parties over history have exercised our constitutional duty to advise and consent to the president's nominations. And in the past, the Senate has rejected extreme nominations. To stay quiet when a nominee so obviously unfit comes before us, that sets a dangerous precedent. Think about the damage you'll not just be doing to the institution of the FBI or to the Senate, but to the trust that millions of Americans deserve to have in our law enforcement. But more important than that, today, consider this, that someday in the future, possibly the near future, when a loyalist FBI director abuses the position and fails to protect the American people, it won't just be Kash Patel that will be held accountable. It won't just be President Trump we will try to hold accountable. It will be every member of this body who supported his nomination that will also be held accountable. So I invite you, I encourage you to have the courage to say no to Trump because lives are on the line. Have the courage to stand up and protect your constituents, protect the American people. Stand up, do the right thing, vote no on this nominee. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Minnesota is recognized.
Mr. President, I rise to strongly oppose the confirmation of Kash Patel to serve as the next director of the FBI. The FBI director leads our nation's most important law enforcement agency. It is made up of more than 38,000 nonpartisan public servants who work every day to take on violent crime, get fentanyl off of our streets, investigate cyber crimes, protect our national security, and so much more. The Bureau's motto is fidelity, bravery, integrity. And its director must be someone who embodies those core values above all else. That is not Kash Patel. Let's start with fidelity. The FBI director's loyalty is not to the president. It is to the truth, the Constitution, the American people. But Mr. Patel has made it clear that his only loyalty is to the president. Mr. Patel has threatened to come after the president's critics. On one podcast in December of 2023, by the way, that's 2023, just a few years ago, not 2 decades ago, not when he's in high school. In 2023, he said, and I quote, "We're going to come after you, whether it's criminally or civilly. We'll figure that out. But yeah, we're putting you on notice." And on another podcast last August, he said, "When Trump wins in 2024 and is in power in 2025, we can prosecute them," referring to Justice Department officials. That was just last August. At his hearing before the Judiciary Committee, we gave Mr. Patel numerous opportunities to explain, to walk back his threats. He chose not to, nor did he try to explain his so-called deep state list of former government officials, including many Republicans who served under the president's first term. This list of his deep state government gangsters, as he called them, list included former Defense Secretary Mark Esper, former CIA Director Gina Haspel, former National Security Advisor John Bolton, and former Attorney General Bill Barr. Bill Barr, who had received so many compliments from people in this body, from so many Republicans, including the chair of the Judiciary Committee. I remind our colleagues on the other side of the aisle that Bill Barr wrote that putting Patel in charge of the FBI, promoting him in any way, would only happen, quote, "over his dead body," end quote. Gina Haspel threatened to resign to stop Patel from becoming her deputy. And John Bolton said that Patel demonstrated no policy aptitude at all. Mr. President, these are staunch, lifelong Republicans. They are experienced and respected people. I may not agree in any way with everything they've said or done, nor does everyone here, but we do agree that they are people of integrity. Mr. President, if these people can end up on Kash Patel's deep state list, we can only imagine what that would mean for anyone who might not be deemed sufficiently loyal to the president. We know what Mr. Patel wants to do with the people on his list because he already told us. In one interview, he said the people on the list, quote, "need to go to prison," end quote. And his comments about his so-called enemies are not empty threats. His desire to punish all but the president's most zealous loyalists is far too real. At his hearing, Mr. Patel said that, quote, "all FBI employees will be protected against political retribution," end quote. Yet, mere hours later, the administration forced out 8 of the Bureau's most senior, nonpartisan public servants who oversaw national security, criminal, and cyber matters. One day later, an email was sent to FBI employees requesting a list of everyone who had worked on January 6 cases, quote, "to determine whether any additional personnel actions are necessary," end quote. It wouldn't matter if it's just a brand new person who gets assigned to a case or a senior person. It doesn't matter if these people were prosecuting people, investigating people that actually tried to do us harm in this chamber, chased down former Senator Romney in the hall. That all happened. Destroyed offices of the parliamentarian and others. Cut police officers' faces and injured them. And then when in any crime scene you'd have it investigated, this guy, Kash Patel, is questioning those FBI employees that were simply assigned to the case to work on them. This is not the person we should be putting in charge of the FBI. And I know my colleagues know this. So many of them that were there at the time supported Christopher Wray. I voted for Christopher Wray. He was Donald Trump's choice to run the FBI, but I thought that he would be a man of integrity, and he was. I will also note that applications to the FBI have tripled since he's been in office during that time period because he's improved morale. They've been doing their job and people want to go work there. Mr. Patel's supposed enemies are not only government officials he disagrees with, he has threatened the press as well. No one agrees with every story the press writes. I certainly don't. And I'm sure many of my colleagues have read stories about them that they don't like. But we believe in this country in the First Amendment. Mr. Patel, however, has referred to the media as, again, a recent quote, the most powerful enemy the United States has ever seen, end quote. He said that not even on a podcast. He said that in a speech. Think about that. The media is the most powerful enemy the United States has ever seen, in the words of Kash Patel, nominated to be the director of the FBI, to oversee tens of thousands of agents across the country. Not China, not Russia, not Iran, not terrorists, but the press. And Mr. Patel has already publicly threatened journalists, saying, we're going to come after the people in the media. We're going to come after you, whether it's criminally or civilly. We'll figure it out. But yeah, we're putting you all on notice, end quote. This isn't someone who has any business running the world's premier law enforcement agency. This isn't someone who we can trust to be faithful to our Constitution. This isn't fidelity to the rule of law and impartial law enforcement. It is a direct threat to it. Bravery, fidelity, bravery, integrity. So let's talk about bravery. We all know that the Capitol Police showed bravery far and above the call of duty on January 6, 2021. We know that. We know that many of them, their gear was stuck on a bus, their riot gear. They weren't even able to access it. And so many of them were protecting us, people who worked in this Capitol, when the people that were storming into this Capitol had better gear than the police had. And of course, we've made tons of changes since then, changes to the leadership of the Capitol Police with the new chief, changes to the sergeant at arms, changes to our security profile. We've made those changes. Of course, we should have done that. But what we do know is they showed bravery. But rather than recognize the officers' bravery, Mr. Patel accused those who testified in the January 6 hearings of lying. When asked on a podcast whether Capitol Police officers told the truth in the House of Representatives January 6 committee hearings when they were under oath, Mr. Patel said, and I quote, "No, and lying under oath is a federal offense and they should be investigated for it." Once again, our colleagues on the Judiciary Committee gave him the chance to walk back these comments during his hearings. And once again, he chose not to. In fact, he claimed this wasn't accurate. It was exactly what he said. We have the evidence. We have the facts. We have the proof. Right there, his words. I would think facts and truth and the proof should matter to someone who is asking to be head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, but it doesn't. Literally, this is on YouTube. Anyone listening today could look it up. The men and women of the Capitol Police aren't criminals, they're heroes. And so are the men and women at the FBI who every day put their lives on the line to keep us safe. But Kash Patel disagrees. He wrote in his book, again recently, that, quote, "The FBI has become so thoroughly compromised that it will remain a threat to the people unless drastic measures are taken," end quote. And he called the men and women of the FBI, quote, "utterly corrupt," end quote. How do you think that makes people feel? People out in Minnesota who are going after bank robbers or gangs or drug rings because Kash Patel didn't like one investigation of a bunch of mobsters that came into this Capitol and beat up police. And then he said he wanted the list of everyone that was involved in that. I don't think the FBI is a threat to the people like Mr. Patel. I don't think it's utterly corrupt. And I don't think my Republican colleagues believe that either. I think they admire the people that work at the FBI. In fact, under Mr. Ray's leadership, as I noted, the morale of the agents and personnel at the FBI has improved significantly, 3 times as many people, as I noted, applying as agents. These agents deserve a director who will have their back and continue building the morale at the Bureau, not someone who denigrates their service. And as Kash Patel has done, again, we've got it, his voice saying it, calls for their headquarters to be shut down and turned into a museum. That was one of his later comments. The men and women of the FBI show us every day what it means to embody bravery. And now we need to show them that we too can be brave and tell the president on this one, no, this is not the right person. We know he's your friend. We know you've hung out with him a lot, but this is not the person for this job. I asked my colleagues to vote no on just one of these nominees. I voted yes on some of them. I looked at their credentials. I made a decision. Maybe it wouldn't have been the first person I picked, but I voted yes on some of them. I asked them to vote no on Kash Patel. Integrity, FBI, integrity, I. The FBI runs on facts. It runs on truth. Without truth, the whole system breaks down. And in his hearing, Mr. Patel made clear why Americans should be so concerned about putting someone in charge of the FBI who clearly does not have the integrity the job demands. Mr. Patel did not even have the integrity to stand by his own words that we had on YouTube. Instead of disavowing or providing explanations for his past statements, he repeatedly misled the committee, dodged questions, and claimed ignorance. Claimed he didn't remember things he'd said just a few months before. Why would you want someone in the FBI doesn't remember things they said only a few months before? This is irresponsible at best and deceitful at worst. The director of our nation's most powerful law enforcement agency must be forthright and trustworthy. He must follow the facts and carefully analyze evidence before drawing conclusions. Unfortunately, Mr. Patel has proven that his allegiance is to the president, not to the truth. Mr. President, independence of the FBI from the White House is critical. We recently saw courageous prosecutors stand up for an independent justice system. They resigned instead of carrying out politicized orders from the administration. These were not liberal lawyers. These were not members of the resistance. The acting U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Danielle Sassoon, was a Federalist Society member and a clerk to Justice Scalia. She is a rising star. She is so respected. She has taken on major cases and won against criminals time and time again. And she gave up the position of the acting head of one of the most incredible prosecutor's office in the country, the Southern District of New York. And the lead prosecutor of the case, Hagan Scotton, was a decorated Iraq war veteran. He clerked for Justice Roberts and Justice Kavanaugh when Justice Kavanaugh was on the Court of Appeals. In his resignation letter, he wrote, "I expect you will eventually find someone who is enough of a fool or enough of a coward to file your motion, but it was never going to be me." I think we should think about those words when we take our votes. I expect you will eventually find someone who is enough of a fool or enough of a coward to file your motion, but it was never going to be me. My Republican colleagues need to show some of the same courage as these public servants. They need to stop acquiescing and stand up to this assault on our justice system. And a good place to start is by voting against Patel. The fact is, federal law enforcement and the American people deserve a director who embodies the Bureau's model: fidelity, bravery, and integrity. I will be voting no on his confirmation, and I asked our Republican colleagues to join me in standing up for justice, in standing up for the rule of law. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
President.
The senator from Hawaii is recognized.
Mr. President, as the leading law enforcement agency in our country, the FBI does critical work every single day to keep our nation, to keep us safe. From counterterrorism and counter-trafficking to fighting cyber attacks and so much more. At a time of global instability, FBI agents are working day in and day out to protect us from threats, both foreign and domestic. But today, the FBI and the Department of Justice face a crisis caused not by any outside threat, but rather by the men and women tasked with leading these agencies. Instead of focusing on potential attacks, hacks, or violent criminal enterprises, we have a DOJ and FBI that have been turned inward on themselves. In just the last month, dozens of senior career FBI and DOJ employees have been purged en masse by President Trump and his administration. Hundreds of thousands of the prosecutors and FBI special agents and analysts may be next. In fact, I shouldn't use the word may, will be next. Purging hardworking and dedicated civil servants does nothing to make us safe. In fact, it does just the opposite. Attorney General Bondi recently announced the creation of a, quote, weaponization working group, end quote, only continues this trend. Through this working group, she is doing what she told us she would not do in her confirmation hearings. She is, quote, investigating the investigators with this working group, and I expect next to be prosecuting the prosecutors. I fear what a DOJ and FBI focused inward on themselves mean for the safety and security of our nation. Which brings me to Kash Patel, President Trump's nominee to lead the FBI. For many reasons, Mr. Patel is not the man to answer the many challenges of the moment. Mr. Patel spent his nomination hearings avoiding every hard question, not even the hard questions. I asked him, for example, if he would investigate people on his 60 people on his deep state list. He would not say no. It's pretty clear. This list, and I suspect it's a growing one, but the 60-person list are all the people who are not sufficiently loyal to President Trump. So it has many, many Republicans on the list. And what the heck is he planning to do with that list? Believe me, it's not because they're going to be commended for the work that they did. I asked him in his hearings whether he profited from selling supplements to detox the COVID-19 vaccine. Supplements he promoted on his social media channels. He did not answer. I asked him if Donald Trump lost the 2020 election. He would not answer. He claimed not to know an anti-Semitic extremist named Stu Peters, despite the fact that he appeared in this person's program 8 times. He tried to claim no involvement with the January 6th choir made up of inmates serving in prison for their part in the violent insurrection on January 6th at the Capitol. And of course, we all know all of these inmates have been pardoned en masse by the president. He claimed no involvement with this choir, despite promoting them and hawking their merchandise for years. He was unwilling to provide any details about his grand jury testimony related to the January 6th insurrection, testimony he had to be compelled to give after taking the Fifth Amendment. And of course, Mr. Patel has the same rights as any American to plead the Fifth. But we have an equal right to ask him, as the nominee for the FBI director, no less, why he did so, and to learn what his ultimate testimony was. The one thing Mr. Patel did testify to in response to a question from Senator Booker about whether he was, quote, aware of any plans or discussions to punish FBI agents or personnel associated with Trump investigations, quote. And his response was that he was, quote, not aware of that. We have since learned of credible evidence that Mr. Patel perjured himself with that statement. Mr. President, Mr. Patel is totally unfit to lead the FBI. It's clear he won't discern fact from fiction, and that he will be loyal to Donald Trump and Donald Trump only, which means total disregard for the Constitution and the rule of law. Ours is a nation of laws. But Mr. Patel's nomination is one more indication that Donald Trump fancies himself above the law, even referring to himself as king in a recent tweet, and will weaponize the law however he wants to advance his political agenda. Mr. Patel is a dangerous nomination that will make our country less safe, less secure, and erode America's trust in the FBI. Mr. President, our administrative agencies, and certainly the Department of Justice and the FBI, do not exist to be used as tools for retribution by Donald Trump, Pam Bondi, or Kash Patel. But that is exactly what is happening with our agencies and the firing and the purging of thousands of people who are doing the job of the people. What can be thinking in supporting Mr. Patel to lead an agency that has the tools to spy and go after all the people that he doesn't like? I urge my colleagues to vote no on his nomination, and I yield back.
Mr. President,
Senator from California is recognized.
today the Senate is on track to confirm Kash Patel as director of the FBI. Think about that statement for a moment. Kash Patel, conspiracy theorist, January 6 denier, MAGA sycophant, and political provocateur, will be FBI director. The absurdity of it, the destructive consequences of it. And it's worth asking today, how did we get here to such an extreme point? To this moment when someone so patently unqualified, really disqualified from any position of responsibility, is poised to become director of the nation's preeminent law enforcement agency. Earlier today, I stood with my colleagues out in front of the FBI headquarters, a building that Kash Patel promised to dismantle on his first day as FBI director and turn into a museum of the deep state, the home of a department that we all know he will convert into a political weapon for the president who is a serial lawbreaker and will use Patel as a tool for retribution against his enemies. But in a democracy, law enforcement does not serve the president, let alone someone who fashions himself as a king. Law enforcement serves the people. It is nonpartisan. It is not a vehicle of political payback for a political party. And yet we are watching the FBI and DOJ hollowed out, dismantled, and turned into an investigative and prosecutorial extension of Donald Trump's White House. We are watching it live in real time It is already happening in that building we visited this morning. In just the last month, Donald Trump's Department of Justice has engaged in a brazen, sweeping purge, a rolling Saturday night massacre, an unmistakable campaign to intimidate, to punish, and to drive out thousands of hardworking, nonpartisan FBI and career DOJ employees. This is happening as we speak. Acting Deputy Attorney General Emil Bove fired roughly 24 prosecutors involved in January 6 criminal cases, not for cause, not for corruption, not for misconduct. They were fired for failing what is in effect a loyalty test. A loyalty test. A MAGA mob attacks the Capitol on January 6th to stop the peaceful transfer of power. They beat police officers, gouge them, bear spray them, all in the service of an even bigger crime, stopping the peaceful transfer of power after Donald Trump lost his re-election. And they get pardoned by Donald Trump. The lawbreakers get pardoned. And the brave FBI agents who track down these violent miscreants, these agents get punished. They get fired. They get purged. The one-man wrecking ball that is Donald Trump is turning the world upside down. The criminals are being pardoned and the cops are being punished. Now, Kash Patel sat before the Senate Judiciary Committee and under oath insisted he knew of no plans to punish FBI employees involved in investigations related to Donald Trump. He positively levitated at the suggestion that such a thing could even be true. Then within days, top FBI agents were fired. Thousands of FBI employees, career professionals, were sent a detailed questionnaire demanding they disclose any involvement in investigations related to the January 6th insurrection. A warning accompanied this. Additional personnel actions could follow. And yet, Mr. Patel testified that, quote, there will be no politicization at the FBI. There'll be no retributive actions taken by any FBI should I be confirmed as FBI director. He sat in that committee room and told the Senate all FBI employees will be protected against political retribution. That was a Thursday. 3 weeks ago, the very next day, the purges began. Before the ink had dried on the transcript of that hearing, the retribution campaign had begun. In his written response to questions, Patel denies knowing about these actions in advance, denies knowing whether he discussed these dismissals with the White House, the DOJ, or the FBI. He wrote, I do not recall having conversations with the transition team about pursuing any particular investigations or targets. I asked him in writing about these actions, and his answer was he doesn't remember. But in fact, whistleblowers have come forward to testify or to state that not only did Patel know about the upcoming purges, he was directing those dismissals. How could he not recall that? It wasn't years ago or even months. It was days before. Days before his written answers to those questions, those written answers where he said he couldn't recall, he was directing these purges covertly as a private citizen. But he doesn't recall. Purges of quality career professionals who dedicated their lives to the rule of law, who have been fired, laid off, or forced out because they dared investigate a violent insurrection on our Capitol, or the president's retention of classified documents that contained our nuclear and other national security secrets. There was a time in our country when the FBI was weaponized, when it served as a sword for the president, and the DOJ served as his shield. When Hoover authorized covert harassment campaigns against the perceived enemies of the president, we thought those days were over, and they were over until now. We must not put in place a Roy Cohn for the president, someone who will bend and break the law to serve the president's personal and political aims. For therein lies the path to corruption, to unlimited power, and to malfeasance of the highest order. We put up guardrails to prevent one man and his cadre of company men from turning the Bureau and Department into a partisan and lawless battering ram. We must not take them down, because we know the road that lies ahead. And we know that Donald Trump cannot destroy the nonpartisan character of the FBI and the Department of Justice without his enablers. And Kash Patel is Donald Trump's hand-picked enabler and henchman. The guy who would say yes when everyone else would say no to any immoral and unlawful request made by Donald Trump. The guy who publicized his deep state list, almost half of whom are Republicans. The guy who worked for and retains millions of dollars in stock in a company supported by the Chinese Communist Party. In any normal world, that would automatically disqualify someone from leading the nation's premier law enforcement and counterintelligence agency. This is not someone we would want running the FBI. It would be unthinkable to confirm a nominee who's written an entire book in service of, quote, dramatically limiting and refocusing the scope of the FBI's authority. A nominee who's publicly said, it would be fun to go on a manhunt of government gangsters alongside those who, quote, represent Donald Trump's army to take this country back. I'm of the opinion that the people the FBI should be going on manhunts for are actual criminals, not the president's enemies of the day. The FBI shouldn't serve as Donald Trump's army. Alas, we will not soon forget the last time Donald Trump's army presented itself to us, when they beat down the doors of this Capitol, when they attacked law enforcement and sought to overturn an election. Mr. Patel is quite familiar with that mob. He celebrated them in song. Now, Mr. Patel tried to deny his association with the January 6th choir. He said he had nothing to do with their recording. But earlier on Steve Bannon's podcast, he was all too proud to brag about it. Quote, so what we thought would be cool is if we captured that audio and then, of course, had the greatest President Donald J. Trump recite the Pledge of Allegiance, then we went to a studio and recorded it, mastered it, digitized it, and put it out as a song, now releasing exclusively on the War Room. But when I asked him about this under oath, his response was, and you may never believe this, when he said we did this and we did that, we didn't include him. I don't know what's worse, taking credit for something he didn't do or doing something and then lying about it. But what I do know is this is not the character of someone who should be director of the FBI. At the hearing, I also asked him to turn and face the Capitol Police officers in the room. These officers from the same department that suffered such grievous injuries on January 6th. He couldn't do so. He couldn't look them in the eye. And I don't blame him for being too ashamed. He should be ashamed, celebrating their victimization in a song. He should be ashamed. And anyone voting to confirm him should be ashamed. And yet here we are, on a fast track to rubber stamp his confirmation, asked to turn a blind eye as he takes control of the most powerful law enforcement agency in the country. That is what my Republican colleagues seem poised to do. And I will ask again, how on earth did we get here? And where are we going? By confirming a nominee who is so plainly unqualified, who is tied up in shady business dealings with the CCP and the Kremlin, who made songs with violent cop beaters, who made memes of himself sawing the heads off of members of Congress. How on earth did we get here? Because we all know where this road ends. A weaponized FBI, investigations into anyone who stands up to Donald Trump, elected officials, journalists, Democrats, and Republicans, anyone. Now, I know some of my colleagues seek solace in the belief that if they just toe the line for long enough, they'll be spared. But we all know what happens when someone falls out of favor with Donald Trump. When you're inevitably asked to vote for something or do something so egregious that you cannot possibly continue to say yes. And when you reach that moment, when you're forced to cross the president or abandon your final line in the sand, it will be these moments you remember, the concessions to a wannabe authoritarian that you were willing to entertain, the lines you allowed him to cross so you would be spared his wrath. But you will not be spared. No one is. Not the veteran, nonpartisan employees at the FBI, not the maverick moderate members of this body, not even the most extreme supporters left out in the cold the moment they are no longer valuable to this president. When, not if, when you fall out of favor with Donald Trump, Patel and others may be unleashed on you as well. My colleagues should remember there is more room under Donald Trump's bus than on it. Enabling his administration is a one-way street, and by continuing to go down it, you drive yourselves and the foundations of our democracy to the very precipice. My colleagues, we have a duty today, a duty to the Constitution and a duty to the American people. We have a duty to the 38,000 men and women of the FBI who put themselves and their lives on the line every single day. Those who work in the building where we stood this morning in the freezing cold and in communities and cities across the country, keeping us safe and secure. We must take that duty seriously, because if we confirm Kash Patel, knowing what we are getting, knowing where we are going, we will only have ourselves to blame. Mr. President, I yield back.
The senator from Rhode Island is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm here to join my distinguished colleague from California in opposition to the nomination of Kash Patel and to make crystal clear to this body what he is going to do in that job. He has shown who he is. So when these things go wrong, I want to be absolutely clear that our Republican friends were warned. They will own the consequences of Kash Patel's misbehavior. Let's start with the fact that unlike any FBI director before, this guy is a vitriolic partisan. And those are the stripes he shows when he is left to his own devices, and those are the characteristics he will revert back to when he is running the FBI. Just a few simple examples. This is from his book that contains, called Government Gangsters, and this is a page of his enemies list. Well, Attorney General Bondi said nobody should come to a law enforcement job with an enemies list. So then they had to pretend that this was not an enemies list. Well, of course it's an enemies list. Here's what Kash Patel himself says about it. Names named, roadmap unveiled, the manhunt starts tomorrow. If you're going to set up a manhunt against people, are they not your enemies by any logical definition of the term? He goes on to a video that shows himself chainsawing off the heads of the people on his enemies list, including the handsome junior senator from California and the daughter of former Vice President Cheney. It's a pretty gross image to be cutting the heads off of people with a saw. And he didn't put it up, but he retweeted it. He loved it so much that he put it up on his own media. Things like that are not appropriate for an FBI director. They're bizarre for just a normally weird person, but for an abnormally weird person to be the director of the FBI, things are going to go bad. Be warned. He is also a completely sycophantic suck-up when it comes to Donald Trump. He wrote children's books in which King Donald rules, and his loyal little functionary, Kash, brings justice to him, pursuing the slugs of the FBI. Really? When the FBI is asked to investigate corruption in Trump world, do you think Kash Patel will rise to the occasion, or do you think he'll participate in a cover-up? All you have to do is look at his own conduct and his own history. This is not Democrats saying this. What we're doing is relating what he has said and what he has done. This is Kash Patel on Kash Patel. He spread the really abhorrent lie that federal law enforcement was behind January 6th. On one of the many podcasts and interview shows where he spewed so much disinformation and partisan vitriol, he was asked, looks like you have a preponderance of evidence suggesting there may have been federal law enforcement involved in making January 6th happen. Patel's response, I'll get you to beyond a reasonable doubt. Beyond a reasonable doubt, he believed and said federal law enforcement agencies were behind January 6th. We know that is preposterous. We know that is false. We know that investigations have shown that none of that is even remotely true. That is completely false information. And yet, here he is spouting it, and that's what he's going to look like as FBI director, too. The FBI is going to have to appear before judges and convince judges of the probity of the agency, of the legitimacy of the agency, of the propriety of the investigation, that the department has done a fair job of marshaling the evidence. Here's what he says about judges. We got to start impeaching judges if they've ruled against Donald Trump. They were a political terrorist in his view. Any case that Donald Trump's been charged in, almost every judge is handling this thing as if they were not a judge, but a political terrorist. And of course, he meant the Trump judge down in Florida as the only one accepted. When you start talking about judges that way, you can't then expect judges not to pay attention when you come before them trying to do the work of the FBI. Then there's the question of what his former colleagues have said about him. These are things that he said himself. What have his former colleagues said about him? Every single one a Trump appointee. John Bolton, National Security Advisor. I didn't think he was qualified. I was forced to hire him. Political pressure jammed him into the job, and Bolton said, I don't want any part of this guy. I was forced to hire him. The Attorney General Bill Barr, they tried to force him on Bill Barr as deputy director of the FBI. And he said, Patel has virtually no experience that would qualify him to lead the FBI, and said, over my dead body, does he get that job? These are the job recommendations of his own colleagues that show his unfitness. Over at the CIA, they tried to stuff him in someplace. And the director of the CIA, Gina Haspel, I'm no friend of Gina Haspel, but here's what she said about him. If he came over, she would resign before allowing Patel to assume a position as her deputy. This is a guy who has a record of engagement with Trump appointees that show that he is not qualified, not capable, and somebody that they would resign before they'd let work for them. And now we're supposed to let him work for the American people? It is ridiculous. He testified once in state court on a Trump-related case, and his testimony was, to put it mildly, not convincing. Here's what the judge said. The court finds that Mr. Patel was not a credible witness. His testimony is not only illogical, but completely devoid of any evidence in the record. Okay, people come into court, they lie, the court doesn't believe their nonsense, and statements like this happen all the time in court. But here's where they don't happen. They don't happen with federal law enforcement agents. Because when I was the U.S. attorney in Rhode Island, if one of my FBI agents had gone over into the United States District Court in Rhode Island and testified in a criminal case in such a way that one of the United States District judges said about that witness, he was not a credible witness, his testimony was illogical, devoid of evidence in the record, we'd be looking into that. This comes darn close to being what is called giglio material, material that the government is forced to disclose to future defendants when it bears on the credibility of a government witness, an agent who is a government witness. People lose their careers over giglio material. This, if he was an FBI agent, would have caused a response in headquarters to say, what the hell is going on? How did one of our people get involved in such flagrantly fake testimony that he was called out by the judge in the case like this? And this is the person that they want to put in charge of the organization, whose probity and whose professionalism and whose integrity are essential to the successful working of the organization. And the guy was basically called out as a liar and a fraud in plain court. This guy is a hot mess. And when you have a character like this that lies in court, that runs chainsaw memes about your opponents, that every person who he tried to work with who was senior in the Trump administration said, get this bum out of here, I don't want to be anywhere near him. That's a record. And you all, my Republican friends who are going to vote on this guy, when he gets there and he does what his character tells us he will do, don't think this isn't going to come back to haunt you. And by the way, don't think that his Trump servience as FBI director won't turn on you. Just because he's a vitriolic partisan who despises Democrats doesn't mean that when Trump's ire moves someplace else to Republican office holders, he won't be there to deliver the FBI as an enforcer against you. So there's a lot to be concerned about. I'll close with this. Never before in the history of American law enforcement has somebody sought to attain a high position in American law enforcement who has pled the Fifth Amendment. Not only did he plead the Fifth Amendment, but he refused to tell the committee what it was all about. You can't plead the Fifth unless you have a reasonable expectation that could put you in jeopardy of a crime. What crime? How in jeopardy? Explain that. You're not just a normal person, you're trying to be the head of the FBI. In a civil case, pleading the Fifth entitles the judge to instruct the jury to draw an adverse interest about your testimony, that the jury can find against you because you took the Fifth. Why we have not had a straight answer yet from our Republican colleagues about why the guy who wants to be the head of the FBI pled the Fifth? It is an unprecedented, terrible situation. With that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to begin where my wonderful friend and colleague, Senator Whitehouse of Rhode Island, ended in opposing the nomination of Kash Patel to be director of the FBI. I served as United States Attorney as well, and I know firsthand what an investigation and a prosecution can do to an individual's life, even without a conviction. I used to tell my staff the most important thing we decide to do is to start an investigation or bring charges, because that person will be under a magnifying glass, having to defend himself, even if no charges are brought, and to defend himself, even if there's no conviction, and the charges themselves can do irreparable harm to a person's reputation, his finances, his family, his life. We entrust these positions, investigative and prosecutorial, to people who deserve the credibility and reliance that we give them. So the position of director of the FBI or Attorney General of the United States or prosecutors and investigators who work for them are not ordinary positions. Even potentially in certain situations, they are more powerful than a member of the United States cabinet in the impact they can have on individual lives. For the ordinary nominee, any of the defects in character or experience or performance in past jobs would have been disqualifying. We live in a time that is not ordinary. And this nominee is not normal. I've never seen any nominee to a position of significant responsibility that has as many disqualifying factors in his or her background. But I think that one comment about him that strikes me whenever I read it is the full quote from former National Security Advisor John Bolton. Part of that quote has been cited by previous speakers. I want to read the whole quote. Kash Patel's conduct in Mr. Trump's first term and thereafter indicates that as FBI director, he would operate according to secret police chief Lavrenti Beria's reported comment to Joseph Stalin, "Show me the man and I'll show you the crime." Now, very few people remember secret police chief Beria and the terror he caused in carrying out Joseph Stalin's edicts to destroy people's lives, to execute them, to eliminate their families. But the mantra of Beria and Stalin, "Show me the man and I'll show you the crime," make up the crime to fit the man and we will eliminate him. We're talking here about a nominee who has an enemies list. He calls it something different. He calls it government gangsters. And he's on a manhunt for them. Manhunt is his word. You can use different words, but the point here is he is on a mission to use the powers of this office in Donald Trump's name for political retribution against his enemies, against Trump's enemies, against MAGA's opponents. To use these institutions for political retribution is the height of irresponsibility. Even to hint at it ought to be disqualifying, and he has made it explicit in his past writings and his statements and speeches, not just a couple of times. It is a theme that runs through his public comments, that eliminating enemies through the use of prosecution is not only acceptable, but it's desirable. The FBI is a very special agency, 38,000 civil servants, including 13,000 special agents who go after international and domestic terrorism, cyber criminal syndicates, foreign espionage, organized criminal enterprises, including drug cartels, sexual exploitation, and human trafficking, and many other crimes that affect our lives and the lives of everyday Americans across the country. All different backgrounds, races, religions can be victims of crime that the FBI investigates. And the FBI agents put their lives on the line because pursuing these crimes often puts them at risk from bad guys who may not even know that they're shooting at an FBI agent, but it's somebody pursuing them. They may not know that an FBI agent is operating undercover, and they may be killing him. And so the FBI's work is a dangerous business, but it is for our good and our safety. The American people deserve an FBI leader who is worthy of them. The American people deserve a director of the FBI who will keep them safe and who will make that safety a priority. But in recent weeks, the Trump administration has systematically weaponized and politicized both the FBI and the Department of Justice. On her very first day of office, Attorney General Bondi created a, quote, weaponization working group. Let me repeat that. Weaponization working group. And specifically named targets to be investigated: Letitia James, Alvin Bragg, Jack Smith. All of them have led legitimate prosecutions and lawsuits against President Trump. There have been reports that prosecutors and FBI agents have been reassigned from drug trafficking to do immigration enforcement, from terrorism task forces to immigration enforcement. And the administration has issued allegedly unethical or illegal orders, causing many top prosecutors to bravely resign rather than betray their oaths of office. We're talking about men and women who love their jobs in the Department of Justice and do them well. And they have sacrificed those jobs because they were ordered to take action that was unethical or illegal in their view. We need now more than ever an FBI director who is trustworthy and devoted to the ideals and values of the Department of Justice and the Constitution above all. Anyone taking one of those jobs raises their right hand and swears an oath to the Constitution, not to the president, not to the Attorney General, not to any other official. It is to the Constitution. Kash Patel is not that person, not the person to have that immense responsibility, most especially at this moment. He lacks the judgment, he lacks the integrity, he lacks the character and competence to be FBI director. Kash Patel's contempt for those agents who put their lives on the line has been clear. He's called them, the FBI, one of the most cunning and powerful arms of the deep state. And there are now highly credible whistleblower reports that he may have directed the purging of senior leaders at the FBI, as well as potentially a mass firing of career FBI officials. Those FBI officials who served professionally with distinction, put their lives on the line, purged as a result of Kash Patel involving himself, in fact, in those decisions, even as under oath, in response to my questions, he said, quote, all FBI employees will be protected against political retribution. All FBI employees will be protected against political retribution. Well, we stood in front of the FBI headquarters this morning. In that very building, there are individuals who will be fired because they took assignments. They didn't choose, they were assigned to criminal investigations that happened to involve Donald Trump. Political retribution at its very height. And if he directed the purging of those FBI agents, contrary to the assurances he made to our committee at his nomination committee, Kash Patel was certainly less than truthful with us. I have not been without criticism of the FBI. None of us have been. No agency is perfect. But I am also betting that members of the FBI would say there's room for improvement in this agency. Kash Patel would slash and trash the FBI, not improve it. He would engage in political retribution, not constructive reform. He would weaponize the FBI with that enemies list. He may not say it's an enemies list. He may call them government gangsters. But that manhunt would involve political retribution. And he has conspiracy theories. He's trafficked in them. He said he agrees with a lot of what QAnon says. He engages in election denialism, refusing to say that President Biden won the 2020 election. He's even suggested that the FBI planned the January 6th attack on the Capitol. And he has glorified those rioters by calling them political prisoners and, in fact, aiding them in their defense. Even the rioters who attacked and assaulted police officers and did them grave injury and in some instances contributed to their deaths. He has joined them in song, producing the J6 choir's recording. And he has refused to be honest when it really matters, pleading the Fifth Amendment in the case about Donald Trump's handling of classified documents, and then denying us, or at least refusing to cooperate in providing us with access to the testimony that he offered. The litany of questionable comments, actions by this nominee shows he lacks the character and competence for this job. I've talked about roughly half a dozen various different facts in his background, statements, comments, actions that would be individually disqualifying. Altogether, they paint a picture of someone who has no proper role anywhere near a law enforcement agency, let alone director of the FBI. I'm appalled that my Republican colleagues voted for him in committee unanimously on their side. I'm appalled that so few may vote against him on the floor today. But I am absolutely sure of this one thing. This vote will haunt anyone who votes for him. They will rue the day they did it. To my Republican colleagues, think about it. Think about what you will tell your constituents, more important, your family, maybe your grandchildren, about why you picked and voted for this person who will so completely and utterly disgrace this office and do such grave damage to our nation's justice system. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
President, I ask permission to speak up to 10 minutes.
Without objection, Senator from Vermont is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank my colleagues for joining me here today. I oppose Kash Patel and believe he is the dangerously wrong choice to serve as the director of FBI. We all have great admiration for the FBI. The men and women there serve our nation, do hard work every day, and for decades they've served as a non-political agency that protects us and defends the rule of law. I believe that Mr. Patel is on a mission to wreck the FBI. It's his own words. He wants to turn the FBI building into a monument or museum to the deep state. You know, I believe that this country and Congress is in the midst of a slow-moving but rapidly accelerating constitutional crisis. This is real, and we can ignore it or see it. It began most visibly, of course, in January 6, 2021, when two norms of this republic, the peaceful transfer of power and the renunciation of violence to affect the outcome of a vote count and certification, were breached, and where many members of the House and Senate also voted against certifying the election of the person chosen by the people in their own states. The president continues to say that the election was stolen, and he has coached his nominees to embrace the big lie. Mr. President, the first month of the Trump administration has shown a contempt for the Constitution, an acceptance of lawlessness that is dangerous to the future of our republic. President Trump's election denialism was only an early sign of his disregard for the norms and requirements of the Constitution. Now empowered in a second term by a Congress and a judiciary which refused to assert their independence, Mr. Trump has enacted executive order after executive order to dismantle our institutions. He doesn't have the authority to do what he's doing. The federal funding freeze, clearly unconstitutional, invasion of the Article 1 power of the purse, shutting down agencies created by Congress without authority, revoking birthright citizenship, a constitutional provision that he asserts he can do by executive order, removing leaders of independent agencies created by Congress, clearly unlawful, firing inspectors general in violation of notice requirements created by Congress, unlawful, firing government employees who have civil service protections, clearly unlawful, and pushing really a quid pro quo order at the Department of Justice to drop charges against a corrupt mayor in New York so he'll accede to whatever the wishes are of the Trump administration regarding local enforcement. And that's only a short list. And we have reached a point where a federal judge has found that the White House defied his order to release billions of dollars in federal grants, marking the first time that a judge has expressly declared that the Trump administration is disobeying a judicial mandate. That is trouble. The country is headed into a situation where, in addition to acting without authority, the president and his enablers are indicting, he will defy rulings from the third branch of our government. Vice President Vance has made it very clear what his point of view is on judges. Judges aren't allowed to control the executive's, quote, legitimate powers. And if the courts don't like it, let them enforce it. Of course, under our Constitution, since Marbury versus Madison, the court is the final arbiter of what is legitimate or what is not. And the executive branch must enforce the laws as interpreted by the co-equal branch of government. Mr. President, it is my view that this administration is showing maximum contempt for core constitutional values, including, most importantly, the separation of powers. This is not about what the president's agenda is. This is about his disregard about the limits that apply to each branch of government. And we have a dilemma. There are many in Congress that are fully in support of President Trump's policies. That's his right to pursue them, any member's right to support them. But it has to be that we accept our unique responsibility, each of the 100 US senators, that we have to guarantee that in pursuit of those policies, it is done within constitutional boundaries. That is the glue that has held this country together through thick and thin for nearly 250 years. You know, this is not just talk about civic aspiration. It's a recognition that the separation of powers, that the system of checks and balances, we're custodians of that, each of us here. That the concept of the executive's ambition should be matched with the ambition of the legislature. That's what's held us together through the turmoil of our own history. We have fierce debates about important public policy matters, but what allows us to resolve them, despite intense disagreements, is staying within the guardrails of the Constitution. That process is being threatened directly and aggressively. The president's attack on our Constitution on January 6th has continued to this day. We've witnessed a renunciation of the decision that the American people made in the 2020 election by President Trump's nominees. Many of them who came before us, including Mr. Patel, were unable to simply say who won the 2020 election. They continued the stop the steal narrative even 4 years later. And now we have President Trump in his first month in office acting in ways that continues to challenge the constitutional order. I'm voting against Mr. Patel primarily, but not exclusively, because he's clearly an instrument in that effort to continue eroding the precepts of the Constitution on separation of powers. And I urge all my fellow senators, Republican and Democrats, to embrace the responsibility we have to assert our responsibility and authority as a co-equal branch. This is a difficult time, particularly for many of my esteemed colleagues on the Republican side. You may support, as I mentioned, the policies of the president, but we've got to take a look at how he is going about trying to implement them. That really matters. We are all custodians of the constitutional order. I'm regarding what President Trump has been doing in his first month in office as an illegal rampage. It's a rampage of illegality. He's showing a contempt for Congress and a contempt for the United States judiciary. Mr. Patel has signed on to that agenda. He isn't just someone who will be forced to participate in the president's campaign of retribution. He's an active participant. He's got his enemies list. We know this because his own words said what was the FBI doing planning January 6th for a year? No basis for that other than to set up the attack on the good men and women of the FBI. Mr. Patel is the one who created a list of deep state individuals. This is like Russia kind of stuff, half of whom are Republicans in the so-called deep state. And he called it nothing more than a cabal of government gangsters and allies. This is the department he's going to be leading, really. And he's the one who said, thank you to President Trump for helping put so many government gangsters in their place. Mr. President, Mr. Patel is not the person to lead the FBI. And my hope is that all of us should consider what Mr. Patel will do. He's going to use the power of the FBI to go after all those in government, those in the media, and those across the country he doesn't agree with. He cannot serve as the next director of the FBI. I yield back.
All post-cloture time has expired. The question occurs on the nomination. Do I hear a sufficient second? There appears to be a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsop Brooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Blunt Rochester. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Brett. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Casti. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gallego. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Husted. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Justice. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kim. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McCormick. Mr. Merkley. Mrs. Moody. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moreno.
Aye.
Mr. Mullen. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, sir. Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Britt, Budd, Cassidy, Cotton, Ernst, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Hyde-Smith, Kennedy, Moreno, Paul, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Tillis, and Young. Senators voting in the negative: Duckworth, Durbin, King, Lujan, Murkowski, Murphy, Padilla, Peters, Sanders, Warner, and Welch. Ms. Slotkin, no. Britt, Budd, Cassidy, Cotton, Ernst, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Hyde-Smith, Kennedy, Moreno, Paul, Schmidt, Scott of Florida, Tillis, and Young. Senators voting in the negative: Duckworth, Durbin, King, Lujan, Murkowski, Murphy, Padilla, Peters, Sanders, Warner, and Welch. Ms. Slotkin, no. Mr. Sheehy, aye. Mr. Schatz, no. Mrs. Moody, aye. Mr. Crapo, Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Ms. Rosen, no. Mr. Tuberville, aye. Mr. Husted, aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Ricketts, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Justice, aye. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Graham, aye. Ms. Collins, no. Mr. Marshall, aye. Ms. Lummis, aye. Mr. McCormick, aye. Mr. Schumer, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Wyden, no. Ms. Brooks, no. Mr. Kramer, aye. Ms. Blunt Rochester, no. Mr. Kim, no. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Kane, no. Mr. Warnock, no. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Booker, no. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Heinrich, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Reed, Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Ms. Warren, no. Ms. Hassan, no. Mr. Ossoff, no. Mr. Fetterman, no. Mrs. Smith, Ms. Smith, no. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Coons, no. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Bozeman, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Schiff, no. Mr. Bennett, no. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Mullen, aye. Mr. Lee, Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Gallego, no. Mr. Curtis, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, no.
The yeas are 51, the nays are 49. The confirmation is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the president will be immediately notified of the Senate's actions. I recognize the senator from South Carolina.
Thank you very much to my